So hello, everybody. Welcome to our October lecture. I'm standing in for our president, Roger Richardson, who is not able to be with us this afternoon and who sends his apologies. It's a pleasure for me to speak to us today, Professor Katrina Navickas, who is Professor of History and Director of the Heritage Hub at the University of Hertfordshire. Katrina's work focuses on protest and social and political movements, really from the late 18th century on to the present day. And she also has research interests in modernist architecture and town and country planning. And she's one of the founders of the Rural Modernism Research Network. Her most recent book, from which she'll be drawing for our lecture today, is entitled Contested Commons, A History of Protest and Public Space in England. She's also produced quite a lot of work with a very strong Lancashire focus. If we look back at her work, for example, on loyalism and radicalism in Lancashire from 1798 to 1815. And she also published an edition of the Papers of the Cragg family of Wyresdale for the Record Society as well. So it's a delight to welcome her to speak to us today. Thank you very much, Katrina.
Thank you, Fiona, and thanks to the Society for inviting me. So today I'm going to be talking about the right to roam and the origins of the right to roam movement, with a focus on Lancashire, and a focus on the 1890s. So as Fiona said, this is taken from a chapter in my book where I look at moorland and thinking about footpaths and ways in which people used the countryside and contested the countryside from the late 18th century onwards. So to start, we think about moorlands and fields as sites of liberty, of freedom, and particularly of leisure for the working and the middle classes. And the Southern Pennines, our own landscape is associated with democratic movements like Chartism. So the famous hikes up to Blackstone Edge in the 1840s. So there is an element of association of moorland in particular with this idea of freedom, an escape from the industrial working conditions that many people endured in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But we associate mainly the right to roam and the mass trespass movement with Kinder Scout. The Kinder Scout mass trespass in 1932, which, as we know, happened in the Peak District in Derbyshire. For many in the Labour movement, Kinder Scout is a keystone in that story of achieving some right to roam, although we still don't have a full right to roam in England and Wales. And there's a tendency amongst many of the accounts of the right to roam movement to see Kinder Scout as the be all and end all, the main event, so to speak. But if you look at the history of the fight for access to moorland, it has a much longer history than that happened in the 1930s. And the history of Kinder Scout itself is problematic. The focus on one event often obscures the much longer battles and contestations over footpaths and access to open spaces that preceded them in the 1890s. So I'm not going to talk about Kinder Scout in this talk. We're looking backwards to the late 19th century, and we're thinking about mass trespass before the mass trespass of 1932. And I argue that actually the peak of agitation for the right to roam and access to footpaths occurred in the 1890s and occurred mainly in the Southern Pennines in Lancashire and on the border with the West Riding. And it was the effect of changes that happened in the 19th century in the moorland environment caused by major landowners and industrialists that created a big change to access conditions that spurred on more contestations for the right to roam. Landowners implemented what I call the 4Gs in the book, which are grouse, golf, gathering grounds, and guns. And I'll go on to talk about two of those in a bit more detail in the context of two of the main events that we need to know about in the history of the 1890s, the Winter Hill mass trespass, which has been commemorated relatively recently, but also smaller events, particularly around Darwen and Blackburn. The struggle for access to open countryside demonstrated the power of local landowners who were beginning to expand their control over not just the land, but also its amenities, particularly water supply. And the contests were not necessarily about right to roam the whole of the land, but particularly focused on footpaths and footpath access. And the tensions in the movement over access to the countryside revealed deep divisions of class, gender, and politics that would then erupt eventually at Kinder Scout in the 1930s. So to begin with, the landscape of the Pennine moorland technically is known as waste. Common land comes in two flavours, two types. One is the commons, which is generally cultivated land used for arable crops, and wasteland, which is more generally used for pastoral farming of sheep and cows. And Lancashire and the West Riding actually had quite small proportions of waste. So Lancashire only had about 9% of its percentage of the county was wasteland in 1800. And it experienced less parliamentary enclosure than other counties and other parts of the country. But much of the enclosure was concentrated in the peri-urban surroundings of the industrial cities, which were and industrial towns and villages that were expanding quite rapidly in the early 19th century, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars period of 1800 to 1815, when manufacturers, mine owners, and industrialists needed more land for developing their mines, spreading out bleaching grounds, which used a lot of space to bleach cloth, and simply for building working class housing, factories, were built particularly on wasteland that was enclosed through Parliamentary Act, needed an Act of Parliament to allot land to private uses. And in particular, the areas around Bolton and around Blackburn were dramatically urbanised through this process of enclosure. So we tend to think about enclosure as an agricultural process as part of the agricultural revolution, but actually in industrial areas in the north, it fuels urbanisation and industrialisation. And we see the loss of footpaths quite rapidly. So this is a slide from the 1794 William Green's map of Manchester and Salford. This is just on the Oldham Road. And it's basically still fields, although you can see that they've started to lay out some streets. And I've marked out the footpaths in red dotted lines. And these are traditional customary routes between handloom weaving villages. People used, if you read Samuel Bamford's accounts, weavers used them to go and bring the cloth into Manchester on a market day and then bring the raw goods back to their houses. So footpaths were very well used in this kind of semi-industrial period, but quite quickly they get built on. This is a later map, a west map, and you can see quite clearly the old Oldham Road station's no longer there, and the red lines are now extinct. They're all built on with rows and rows of terraced housing. So footpaths become the key issue for both local inhabitants, but also campaigners in various political points of view. So defence of the rights of way becomes indelibly associated with democratic activism in the 1820s. So government passed up the Stopping Up of Unnecessary Roads Act in 1815, which simplified the process in which you could close a footpath. It only needed the simple assent of 2 justices of the peace. One of the most active enclosure commissioners in Manchester area was Colonel Ralph Fletcher, who was a gentry mine owner in Bolton, who acted as one of the leading magistrates on the bench at the Peterloo massacre. And in the minds of the democratic radicals, Fletcher therefore served as a direct link between the governing elite's repression of the working class and their restrictions to meet and hold political meetings, but also a link to the sort of closing up of footpaths and restricting their right to move around. And so it's no coincidence, therefore, that political radicals in this post-Napoleonic Wars period set up societies for the protection of footpaths. The first Footpath Preservation Society was founded in York in 1824, followed quite quickly by the Manchester Association, Society for the Preservation of Ancient Footpaths in 1826, and some of its members were present at the Peterloo massacre and became liberal journalists and campaigners like Archibald Prentice. Like the Commons Preservation Society that was formed 40 years later, the main activity of these societies was to seek legal challenges against the stopping up of footpaths. The first case that the Manchester Society organised was against Magistrate Ralph Wright, who between 1824 and 1827 built a wall and sowed crops over footpaths in his estate in Flixton, then a village south of Manchester. The legal case received a wide range of support and was funded sufficiently to reach the courts. Prentice notes that it cost £750 to put forward the case. But peaceful and direct action continued to be intertwined, if sometimes in tension. Archibald Prentice recalled how local farmers had already broken down several times the obstructions that had been put up and restored the original road to the public by treading down the oats. As with the agitation to unenclosed commons, direct action, pulling up of fences, restoring paths and rights of way went hand in hand with legal action of the footpath preservation societies, although the organised societies were quite keen to show that they didn't condone such direct action. Locals walked in procession along closed footpaths, breaking down walls, trampling offending crops. The radical newspaper, the Manchester Gazette, followed the campaign intently, defending the concept of rights of way for all and denouncing the corruption of gentry landowners. And the Footpath Society did win its case against Ralph Wright, and he was forced by the courts to reopen the footpath. Individual action was seen quite often, particularly again in these areas where enclosure was used to build housing and manufactories. So this is the enclosure map of Northmoor in Oldham, and quite quickly this is a later map showing the mills and the mill reservoirs that were built as part of the allotment of those plots of enclosure. And the Oldham diarist, Edwin Butterworth, reported how court cases were put for trespass where the employers of the manufacturing Seville and Wolsterholm iron founders and machine makers in Longmoor, they'd attempted to stop up an ancient footpath by putting iron bars and metallic liquid, presumably mercury, across the road, and a considerable number of inhabitants cleared the road of all the obstructions, destroyed 2 iron pillars, and they returned again the following night to do the same. But the mill owners not only got constables to arrest the people who were doing this action, but also there seemed to be some agitation throwing this metallic fluid around. There's further cases of these mix of court action and direct action over these traditional rights of way, which create tensions in the society. The actions at this particular event were happening in May, June 1842, so at the height of the plug strikes, which was larger industrial unrest involving steam loom workers removing the plugs from boilers to stop factories working. So there's certainly a sense of class tensions in which these sorts of actions contribute. The Footpath Preservation Societies continued until the 1860s, and later associations were directly descended from many of them. The funds of the Manchester Footpath Preservation Society eventually ended up in the hands of the Peak District and Northern Counties Footpath Preservation Society, which was founded in the 1890s. And I think there's a direct connection between those earlier societies that were quite locally based and the much more regional and much more organised societies that we associate with Right to Roam that emerged in the 1890s. But I'd like to sort of go back here and talk about the changes in the landscape that happened between the 1840s and the 1890s to explain why the Right to Roam movement develops even further and how we get to points of mass trespass rather than these individual events and individual acts of resistance. So the uplands of northern England, particularly the Pennines, were transformed in this mid-19th century period through 4 major kind of changes that are implemented particularly by large landowners and local elites, and what I've called gathering grounds, grouse, golf and guns. These different types of land uses, particularly for leisure but also for industry, increasingly privatised the landscape even further beyond what had been enclosed and restricted access even further. So I'm going to focus on gathering grounds in particular because I think it's relevant for the mass trespass movement, but there's also lots of cases of golf courses and also the army using land, requisitioning land for training grounds as well, which comes into it. I'll also talk about the rise of grouse moors. So reservoirs and their gathering grounds became sites of trespass and sites of contestation over access. Reservoirs were built usually on traditional rambling sites, local inhabitants, as urbanisation was closing access to open spaces. In 1833, quite an important select committee was set up in the House of Commons, reporting on the effects of industrialisation on people's access to what they called public walks. So the select committee report in 1833 had a succession of the new MPs who were elected under the 1832 Great Reform Act, many of whom were northern industrialists representing their new boroughs for the first time. And there's several accounts from among them of these clashes over access to gathering grounds and footpaths. So Richard Walker, for example, who was the Liberal MP for Bury, he was a woolen manufacturer. He made this testimony: we only have the walks which formerly were outlets from the town to different farms in the neighbourhood. The reservoir is the only place resorted to, and that is private property. It belongs to the canal company, and they're rather jealous of the trespass along the banks. now they're congregated together in large manufactories. There's no means of exercise. He's talking about the workers here. They've got an hour for dinner. A very small proportion of that could be devoted to exercise. And even when they do take exercise, they either trespass on their neighbours' lands or play in the public street. I only know that on a fine Sunday evening, the turnpike roads out of the town are crowded with people. I know that they would much rather walk in the fields if they could. There've been a great many places stopped up in my town by order of the magistrates. So there's several accounts by MPs and by other groups. For example, Benjamin Braidley, who's the Borough Reeve of Manchester, similarly observed that for working class Mancunians, I am not aware of where they can go as a matter of right. They've been generally allowed, I believe, to promenade around the large reservoir belonging to the Waterworks Company of Beswick. And despite the restrictions, local inhabitants continued to trespass. Braidley observed, we frequently find that in walking, they go out to several places where there's no regular right of road, but they still make a road to enjoy a little fresh air. Children resort to the fields and are permitted to do so by the tenants. But water companies in particular seem particularly officious in charging people with trespass. So trespass is a civil event, civil offence. You take people on a private um, charge to court. So the water company of Manchester Waterworks Company in 1838 took a 15-year-old boy to court for trespassing at Gorton Reservoir, for which he was fined 10 shillings. The newspapers commented it has been the practice for a number of lads to meet there each Saturday for the purpose of running races, and a man was at length stationed there to prevent the trespass, which had occasioned great damage to the property, or at least the reservoir company, canal company alleged. So this was a clash between industrial workers and industrial people going out to the countryside to just get some fresh air, get some exercise, and the water companies really trying to prevent people from accessing the reservoirs. Municipal corporations gradually took over from manorial government from 1835, and under the Public Health Act of 1875, the sanitary committees of local authorities were required to ensure safe drinking water for their populations. So municipal councils increasingly took over waterworks companies, effectively making them municipal amenities. And by 1901, 90% of large provincial towns were supplied by municipal water companies. And access to gathering grounds became one of the major reasons why mass trespass occurred from the 1890s onwards. And I think it's interesting that it's not against private landowners, it's actually against municipal authorities, the corporations, that people are trespassing. And again, just like the private companies, the municipal corporations are just as officious in trying to stop trespass on their property around the reservoirs. Another factor that increased the potential for conflict by the late 1800s was that the 1894 Local Government Act enabled urban district councils to issue access orders to waste within their administrative boundaries, i.e. There was a growing push already for access to footpaths, and the Local Government Act of 1894 enabled local councils who had manorial waste, this moorland, this open fell land, they could issue essentially an open access order if they so wished, and people had kind of a right to roam. But this clashed with the ownership of the reservoirs and the gathering grounds, much of which had expanded throughout the 19th century to not only provide drinking water for the towns, but also continued supply of water for the steam power for the mills. So that was one source of conflict, was the waterworks. The second big change that you see in the Pennine landscapes in the 1800s is the development of grouse shooting as a leisure activity for the gentry and the middle classes. There'd always been grouse moors, but the nature in which the sport was conducted changed in the Victorian period. So moorland was developed much more intensively for the sport. So the Game Act of 1831 took control over game from lords of the manor, and conferred it upon any owner of the moors. So it wasn't just the manorial lord who controlled who was allowed to shoot for grouse. It could be any of the landowners, who, they may have not been the same people. The impact of this change was to raise rental value of moorland shooting estates and enable the formation of shooting clubs. Grouse shooting became much more of a leisure sport for wealthy landowners, middle classes aspirant to be gentry from the 1860s onwards, also aided by improved technology such as the arrival of breech-loading shotguns. The sport became much less hunt-like and much more sedentary. So the Darwen News in 1896 observed it consists not in walking after them across the heather and shooting them over dogs in the old-fashioned style. The exercise is too severe. The sportsmen simply wait in 2 or 3 butts or batteries made of turf and are placed on the southerly edge of the moor. And from these hiding places shoot at the grouse as they are driven over their heads by beaters employed for the purpose. Stone butts were constructed on the moorland with walls and hedges to keep the grouse in. There were ecological impacts of this too, with rotational burning of heather forming a key part of managing the landscape for the leisure purposes. So 2 of the big conflicts over access to moors occur over reservoirs and then grouse moors from the 1880s, 1890s onwards. The popular movement for access to the commons and waste develops a much more socialist and democratic flavour. I mean, it had its roots in radical democratic action, but hadn't been a mass movement. But with the Reform Act of 1884-85, granting the right to vote to a much larger population, proportion of the population, to around 5.7 million adult men, the increase in the voting proportions increased the kind of vitality and the contestation in local elections, and general elections being fought on local issues at borough level. And access to the countryside became quite a common issue that was debated and claimed by different candidates at local and general elections. Footpath issues became key pledges in many political contests. As I said before, the 1894 Local Government Act also created more of a kind of issue around access to the moorland, because it declared that district councils had to protect rights of way in areas of waste under their jurisdiction. And the rise of the independent labour and socialist movements in this period also increased the stakes for competing political parties over local issues. So trade unions and the socialist parties, particularly the Social Democratic Federation, the SDF, which had been founded in 1881, saw organised trespass and public meetings over access disputes as ideal recruiting ground for new members. Socialists used trespass to score a point against the aristocracy over public access and political representation. But it wasn't just a socialist issue. Middle-class Gladstonian liberals also sought to make capital of popular agitation by pointing to aristocratic corruption and landlordism, as manifested in exclusions exercised by landed estates against local inhabitants. Changes in working class leisure practices also had an impact in increasing demand for access to the countryside. So clarion clubs, hugely popular socialist walking, rambling, and later with the invention of the bicycle, cycling clubs, grew alongside and out of movements for voluntary action and working class responses to social change in the late Victorian and early Edwardian period. And with the Bank Holiday Act of 1871, there was expanded leisure time for the working classes and the middle classes. And with labour legislation and further legislation, people simply had more time and used that in outdoor pursuits. So there was increased demand for access to the countryside, particularly as an escape from polluted industrial urban centres. So I argue that 1896 was the key date rather than 1932 in popularising and the significance of mass trespass as a tactic. It was the peak of organised demonstrations against the stopping up of footpaths and other forms of exclusion. And the southern Pennine moors became the centre of agitation, particularly in Lancashire, including the now well-known trespass over Winter Hill of Bolton. There's also a peak of agitation over access to public parks, particularly for the use of political meetings. So 1896 sees the contest over Boggart Hole Clough in North Manchester, where the Socialists and the Independent Labour Party sought to use that space, which had just been bought by Manchester Corporation, use it for demonstrations. And there was it became a national issue over the right of assembly and the right of free speech. And it was made quite famous by the Pankhurst family and the early suffragettes as well. So there's a huge range of access disputes, not just in the moorland, but also in public parks in 1896 in particular. So the Winter Hill dispute began when Colonel Henry Ainsworth, a Liberal industrialist in the bleaching business, succeeded to the ownership of Smithhills Moor in 1896. Seeking to consolidate his landownings, he closed a footpath over the estate known as Coalpit Road. The powerful local branch of the Social Democratic Federation and rambling societies rallied up to 12,000 residents and supporters to trespass over the path over 3 weekends in September 1896. The campaign was supported by the middle classes, who used the campaign to increase their social recognition and civic pride. Ainsworth sought an injunction from Manchester Chancery Court against the trespassers in the following year. Witnesses were brought out at court by the access campaigners, such as William Fletcher, 70-year-old bricklayer, who testified how he had used the road throughout his lifetime and now it had been stopped up by Ainsworth. But the legal costs were too much for the socialists, who withdrew from the campaign, and the court ruled in favour of Ainsworth, the landowner, and the path was not confirmed as a right-of-way until a century later. The access issue was sustained as a part of municipal politics, especially by the journalist Solomon Partington, who rallied against the corruption of local authorities. Among the promoters of access, it wasn't just a socialist issue. There were some paternalist Tory gentry who sought to show their civic largesse by calling for open spaces for the urban working classes. The Winter Hill trespasses, though initially unsuccessful, nevertheless entered the mythology of rambling and the right to roam. The ballad Will You Come Home Sunday Morning was composed to commemorate the first trespass and attract inhabitants to the next demonstration. I'm not going to sing it. There are recordings of people singing it at the commemorations at the 125th commemoration a couple of years ago. The population of the promotion of popular ownership of the commons, and there's a line in the song about the moortops, the hilltops being yours and mine, becomes part of the mythology of the commons, the idea that the commons belongs to everyone. And the song becomes an anthem that resurfaces periodically, most recently, as I've said, at the 120th anniversary in 2021. Like at Kinder Scout, the Labour and Socialist movements used commemoration as a useful vehicle for gaining solidarity over a wide set of contemporary platforms, including the right to roam. And it's important here to note that this wasn't a mass trespass in the sense of right to roam. It's about reopening the footpath. So footpaths still exclude people from the rest of the moorland. They're still quite restrictive. So this isn't about wanting to wander all over the moor. It's about reopening the footpath. But it becomes a kind of totem for that wider campaign. The second campaign that emerges in 1896 is at Darwen Moor, less well known and it's a bit more complicated. But I'll just go through some of the key highlights here because I still think it's important. It reflects how active lots of the different Pennine and moorland areas were in contesting access in this year. The contest over access to Darwen Moor is depicted often in local history as the origin story for Jubilee Tower, the 85-foot tower erected on the summit, 1,220 feet above sea level overlooking the town. It was erected in commemoration of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1898 and is seen as representing the victory of the campaign for public access to Darwen Moor. There are some problems with this. It's a bit more complicated that there's one academic studied the campaign, Harvey Taylor's Claim on the Countryside, where he implies that the council will give an ownership of the moor after the access campaign secured access to the moor, which isn't quite true. A lot of it remained in private hands. But essentially, the moor comprised of about 280 acres. Until the 1870s, there's no formally designated open space in the town. Darwen's a linear town along the valley. It's very cramped and packed in, and there's very little open space in the town. The Commons Act of 1875 promoted some of Darwen's residents to begin agitating public access to some of the moorland. And in the 1870s, local labourers undertook resistance against local gamekeepers. The Lord of the Manor was an absentee vicar, the Reverend W.A. Duckworth, and a guy called Edmund Ashworth had purchased a lease to the gaming rights over the moor, and he and this absentee vicar issued a writ against 5 men, 3 labourers, a gardener and a mason, and they claimed sporting rights as customary rights. And enacted a trespass in July 1878. They came together upon said moor and walked up and down the heather so as to drive the game and disturb the said right of sporting of Edmund Ashworth. The case was heard at the Court of Chancery in 1879 and injunctions served against the men. As with many cases, it goes on forever. It's a long-running case and forms the background for the access dispute in 1896. The corporation reached a compromise with the Lord of the Manor, who agreed to local authority laying out and maintaining new footpaths across the moor to allow public access while keeping them off the grouse moor. And also they, as a compromise, the municipal authority opened 2 public parks to the west of the town as part of the Queen's Jubilee celebrations, Whitehall Park in 1887 and Bold Venture Park, I think in 1888. And they enclosed the fairground, which was fitted up with gymnastic appliances as a public recreation ground. The new footpaths over Darwen Hill quietened the immediate agitation, but as the newspapers noted, Darwen's population expanded quite rapidly in the 1890s, from 34,000 in 1891 to 40,000 5 years later. And footpath campaigners led by William Ashton, the Justice of the Peace, increasingly highlighted the disparity of access. They argued that the 2 public parks were not enough, and they were at the southern end of the borough and not accessible to people at the northern end. Edmund Ashworth continued to refuse to give up his rights to the game moors. The campaigners alleged that as the shoots only took place for a few days in the autumn, the restrictions on access were overtly severe. The other contention was that the grouse shoots only produced 15 to 20 brace of grouse a year anyway, and so weren't worth holding. So on the Sunday, the 5th of May 1895, the trade societies, together with Burnley and District Federation branches of the SDF, organised a demonstration on the moor. And the demonstration was more like a kind of traditional May Day gathering. It wasn't a kind of protest, but a kind of gathering with, people in their Sunday best. it gets quite complicated, but the three sons of the magistrate who'd started the agitation offered to buy the shooting rights and promote an application of access. And eventually it was agreed by the corporation, an agreement that specified that the public had free access to 55 acres of land on the northern side of the common. So you can see this kind of slightly darker shaded area towards the northern end of the green area on the map. But the remaining 255 acres was still reserved to the Lord of the Manor for shooting. But there were new access routes plotted across the estate. The Jubilee Tower was funded by subscription, and the stone was donated by Reverend Duckworth, a noble gesture considering the legal wranglings. So the vicar who'd tried to bring trespassers to court eventually donated some of the stone for the monument. So the rumblings go on into 1896, and I don't really have time to go into the detail about that, but I think it's significant that these rights of way issues are about access to the countryside, but become quite wrapped up in local politics, the local municipal politics at the time, party personalities. So we can't generalize about trespass incidents, certainly in this period. They're very much dependent on who the landowner is, who were the councillors of the local borough, how powerful the socialists are. So Harvey Taylor's book seems to downplay the impact of the Social Democratic Federation and argue it was more the Tory paternalist landowners who secured access to parts of the moor in the council. But I don't think we should underestimate the significance that the Socialist Democratic Federation were quite strong in Darwen and the surrounding region, and did help organise these trespasses. There were many other footpath disputes that I can mention. There's I've got records of footpath dispute in 1896 in Pendle Hill, and one in Worsley, and in Padiham. And again, these involved a mixture of local personalities, the Social Democratic Federation, and local footpath preservation societies. They didn't achieve the publicity that, say, the Bog at Hole Clough or Winter Hill disputes achieved nationally, but they were still hugely important in fostering both conflict and cohesion over aspects of rights of way, access issues, and ideas around the rights of local people to access their countryside. And it ensured, these smaller disputes ensured that footpath preservation and the right to roam movement were not just a kind of middle class concern, but had grassroots among working class residents. So yeah, just zoomed. Sorry, I forgot we can zoom in to have a look at Darwen Moor, and there's Jubilee Tower. And even sort of after the access disputes, actually the populations of some of these towns still have very little access to open space. They're still very densely packed, even though they are surrounded by moorland countryside. And that's what I plotted the open space available to Darwen using some open data from government records today. And as you can see, most of the open space is golf course still in today, or very small plots of land. And again, the public plots are few and far between. So that's to finish, really. That's taken from the moorland chapter of my book, which goes on to look at all the different other types of different public spaces and open spaces that were contested in the north and across England in the 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you.